Did the US really plan to nuke the moon? And why was it kept secret for decades? What if I told you the US once planned to nuke the moon, not as a weapon, but as a cosmic show of force? Sounds like sci-fi, right? But this insane Cold War idea was very, very real. Here's the forgotten story of Project A119. In the 1950s, the Cold War wasn't just fought on Earth, it was heading into space. After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, panic rippled across the United States. It wasn't just about satellites. It was about symbolic dominance. America feared the world would see the USSR as technologically superior. The race wasn't just to the moon, it was to impress. And what's more impressive, the Pentagon thought, than causing a visible nuclear explosion on the moon? It wasn't about destruction, it was about making a point, a very bright, radioactive one. The plan had a name, Project A119. It was launched in deep secrecy by the US Air Force in 1958. The objective? Detonate a nuclear warhead on the dark side of the moon so the explosion would be visible from Earth. The flash would be seen globally, screaming America's technological might. This wasn't about military gain. It was pure psychological warfare, a cosmic flex. But planning to nuke another celestial body had complications. And soon, some of the world's brightest minds were brought into the madness. Among those tapped to help, a young, brilliant scientist named Carl Sagan. Yes, the same Sagan who'd later become a beloved voice of space exploration. But back then, he was a rising academic. The Air Force needed someone to model the dust plume that a lunar nuclear blast would generate. Sagan's task: calculate how big, how visible, and how impressive the explosion would be from Earth. It was mad science. And Carl Sagan was right in the middle of it. Years later, when parts of Project A119 became public, Sagan's secret role shocked even his admirers. Why not just nuke space? Or build a giant satellite? Why the moon? Because it was visible, symbolic, and impossible to ignore. A flash on the moon's surface would have made headlines across Earth. It was a stage, and the US wanted to steal the show. But the moon also represented something deeper. Humanity's dreams, untouched and mysterious. Nuking it wasn't just science, it was a statement. One that said, we own space. And back in 1958, owning space seemed critical to survival. The bomb they wanted wasn't just any bomb. It had to be small, light, and powerful enough to be seen from Earth. The weapon of choice? A W-25 nuclear warhead. Only about 50 kilotons compared to Hiroshima's, but still massive in effect. Engineers worked to figure out how to launch, guide, and impact the warhead onto a specific lunar location. The tech? Rudimentary. The risk? Gigantic. But the appeal of delivering the first nuclear explosion in space was too tempting for some to ignore. Here's the twist. The Soviets had the same idea. Declassified documents show the USSR also considered a lunar nuclear detonation in the late 1950s. They too saw it as the ultimate propaganda coup. The Soviet plan code named E-Project was slightly more conservative, focusing on a landing and blast analysis, not visibility. But make no mistake, both superpowers seriously considered nuking the moon. It was a global space-age standoff, with our nearest celestial neighbor in the crosshairs. Blowing up part of the moon wasn't just dangerous, it was incredibly unpredictable. Scientists struggled to model what would happen to lunar dust, how high it would rise, and whether the explosion could cause visible crater changes. The moon has no atmosphere, so debris wouldn't burn up, it would just fly. And if that debris got caught in Earth's gravity, pieces of the moon could come falling back to us. That's right, one wrong calculation, and we could have caused lunar shrapnel rain over Earth. Not exactly a victory lap. Imagine the public reaction. You walk outside one night, look at the moon, and see a scar, a new crater, maybe a permanent dark spot. The global outrage would have been enormous. Religious leaders, scientists, and citizens alike might have seen it as a desecration of something sacred. Back then, Americans hadn't even walked on the moon yet. To destroy part of it before ever touching it, that would have rewritten history, not as a triumph of spaceflight, but as a cosmic blunder of arrogance. Not everyone on the project was comfortable. Some scientists started raising ethical concerns. Carl Sagan, among others, reportedly had second thoughts. The risks were immense, the science shaky, and the moral implications troubling. What message were we sending to the universe by nuking our nearest neighbor? And could the fallout literal or metaphorical trigger more space weaponization? Voices began quietly, urging caution. But in the Cold War's fevered grip, hesitation was often mistaken for weakness. Everything about Project A119 was locked under layers of classification. No one in the public knew. Even many in the government had no clue it existed. Researchers couldn't talk. Notes were shredded. The Air Force even considered denying the project ever existed if it leaked. It wasn't just a science experiment. It was a top-tier military secret. It would be decades before the world found out the truth. And even then, it came out in pieces. By the early 1960s, priorities shifted. The US had a new goal, not to blow up the moon, but to land on it. President Kennedy's moonshot changed everything. Suddenly, peaceful exploration became the new front in the Cold War. Quietly, Project A119 was shelved. It wasn't canceled with drama, just abandoned without fanfare. No press release. No formal end. Just silence. The project faded into the shadows, buried beneath layers of classified history. So, how do we know about Project A119 today? It wasn't through a whistleblower or leaked memo. It came from a biography of Carl Sagan. While researching Sagan's early life, a writer discovered references to his involvement in a lunar nuke study. From there, journalists and historians started digging. Eventually, declassified documents surfaced. The truth was stranger than fiction. America really had planned to nuke the moon, and nearly did. Years later, Carl Sagan never directly condemned Project A119, but many believe he regretted his role. As he grew into one of Earth's greatest cosmic ambassadors, the idea of nuking a celestial body clashed with his message of peace and wonder. His iconic quote, "We are made of star stuff," feels almost like a rebuttal to the idea that we should blast the moon for power. Sagan's silence on A119 spoke volumes. He'd moved from war to wisdom. Though the project never launched a missile, it launched a warning. A119 became a case study in technological overreach, how far we might go to win a psychological battle. It exposed the dangers of letting military ego dictate scientific action. Today, it stands as a surreal footnote in history, but a deeply revealing one. When fear leads and wisdom follows, even the moon isn't safe. Project A119 isn't just a Cold War relic. It echoes in today's growing space militarization. Nations are now building anti-satellite weapons, launching spy constellations, and competing for space dominance. The moon? It's back on the radar, not for nukes, but for resources. But the question remains, how far are we willing to go? Have we truly learned from the mistakes we never made, or just found new ways to play the same dangerous game? What if America had nuked the moon? The explosion would have left a permanent mark scientifically, politically, and culturally. The moon landing of 1969 might have been overshadowed by the stain of destruction. Public trust in space programs might have plummeted. And perhaps the space race would have devolved into an all-out arms race beyond Earth. The world we know today might look up at a moon with a scar and remember it not for dreams, but for detonation. Throughout history, the moon has united humanity. Poets wrote about it, lovers gazed at it, ancient civilizations worshipped it. The moon is more than rock, it's a symbol. That's what makes Project A119 so haunting. It reminds us that even something so universal can become a target. What happens when we start seeing the universe not as a shared home, but as a battleground? The moon was nearly our first casualty in a war that never actually came. Why doesn't anyone teach this in school? Because it's uncomfortable. Governments prefer to celebrate heroic missions, not secret plans to blow things up. Project A119 doesn't fit the space hero narrative. It's not about astronauts or glory. It's about fear, secrecy, and hubris. That's why it stayed hidden for so long, and maybe why some still pretend it never happened. But history has a way of leaking, and sometimes the most buried stories are the ones we need to hear. Project A119 is what happens when science becomes a tool of politics. Brilliant minds were recruited not to explore, but to intimidate. The same minds that could unlock the stars were instead told to weaponize them. It's a lesson in how quickly curiosity can be co-opted. When power takes the wheel, even science can become dangerous. And the scariest part? The scientists often go along, thinking they're just doing math. But that math, it nearly rewrote the moon. There is no nuclear scar on the moon, no shattered crater, no radioactive dust cloud hanging in space. And maybe that's the greatest relief of all, that someone, somewhere, decided not to pull the trigger. Project A119 reminds us that humanity stood at a cosmic fork in the road and chose not to destroy. But it also warns us how close we came. The next time we face such a moment, will we make the right choice again? In the end, we didn't leave a mushroom cloud on the moon. We left footprints. That one decision reshaped how we see space, not as a place to conquer, but to understand. But make no mistake, the line between exploration and exploitation is thin. The cosmos is vast, but our mistakes can echo forever. If this story made you think twice about the past and the future, there's plenty more we've barely scratched. The universe has secrets, and sometimes the most chilling ones were our own.